Hey watch friends, today we're going to check out the return of the very popular Revelot Hexmariner, now in its V2 form. This V2 version is going to be launching on their website on January 23rd of 2024. In case you missed it, previously featured the original Hexmariner as well as the Hexmariner 39. This V2 variant has some nice updates, but most importantly has some really cool new dial options, and we'll be exploring those here. This comes standard with the 2-year warranty, the same as the other Revelot models. As far as the basic specs, measured from roughly the 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock position, this is the larger version and it's coming in at 42.5 millimeters. The bezel is virtually flush, coming in also at 42.5 millimeters. Both of those are plus or minus a hair. As far as the lugs, it's a strap change friendly 22 millimeters. The lug to lug is coming in at 47.9 millimeters. As this does feature male end links, I went ahead and measured those as well. That's coming in at 52.5 millimeters. However, don't be scared off. As we'll see, this wears just fine on my 6.5 inch wrist. The thickness, including this crystal, is coming in at 13.1 millimeters. The crystal itself is a flat sapphire crystal, which does feature inner AR coating. The movement has this beating away with the Seiko NH35. Nice reliable workhorse movement. It's going to be a lower beat, but around 42-hour power reserve, hacking, hand winding, all that kind of good stuff, but very reliable movements. As far as the water resistance, the same as its predecessor, it still features 200 meters or 20 atmospheres. The weight, sized to my 6.5 inch wrist, is coming in at 163.6 grams. So not the lightest in the world, but it actually wears lighter than I think the specs would denote there, so not too bad at all. Now that we have that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a deeper dive into this particular version and what it's like to live with. First, for the colors. This batch is featuring 11 different colorways, so you've got a heck of a lot to look at. There's the white meteorite version that we're looking at today, which is really cool, but there's additionally a light blue version, an old mint version, and both of those are actually full lume dials. There's also a gray version, as well as dark green, 3 different Aventurine options, and several others that you can check out on their website, linked down below. As far as the dial textures, it's going to vary depending on which version you get. The one we're looking at today is a first that I've ever seen meteorite dial that has a white PVD coating on it. So it gives a really cool effect, as we'll see here across lighting conditions. But additionally, they have the return of that 3D or pyramid style dial, and then they also have a new sparkly version with 3 different Aventurine dial options, which that's always a crowd pleaser. The dial layout is going to be similar to the prior. At the 12 o'clock position, you have their brand logo and symbol, and then at the 6 o'clock position, you do have 3 lines of text, and those are printed. Moving out to the perimeter, you can see it does have a nice legible chapter ring, and that's going to be printed as well. Nice clear 5-minute hashes, and then hashes in between with a nice smaller scale for easy legibility differentiation. At the 6 o'clock position, you can see it does have a cutout for the date window, and you can see that that nicely matches the angles of the overall dial. On this particular version, they went for contrasting, so it has a black date wheel. Out on the edge, you can see that this does have, similar to the prior, it has the very steeply sloped rehaut, and that does have, again, a very subtle etching. This time, as opposed to the limited edition versions that we had in the past, this just says the Revelot Hexmariner. It's nice, it's there when you want to see it, but when you don't want to, it really fades off and you can't even tell it's there. As far as the hardware, this carries over again, and it is going to be the angular sword style. So you have brushing strip down the middle, and then you have polished facets on the exterior. In this version, it's a little more subtle because it is blackened as far as the finishing there, but you can definitely see it as the light hits it, and I think it suits the design well. As far as the second hand, this perfectly incorporates with the overall style, sticking with the Hexmariner theme, and you can see that the second hand has a lollipop that's actually a hexagon, but then additionally it has your counterbalance that's a hexagon as well, so very nicely incorporated there. Additionally, it does have a red accent tip on this particular variation, which helps for contrast and legibility, and it also gives you that little bit of pop. As far as the accent colors, you can see that there is the dial text that's the red, then the second hand that has the red tip as well, and then you can see on this particular version, the bezel, it doesn't perfectly match, but it has somewhat of like a salmon coloration for that. Shifting over to the markers, you can see again, this does carry through with the hex theming, and you can see standard hexagons for most of your markers, but then at the 12, 3, and 9 position, you have the elongated hexagons there. Shifting over to the lume on this, just as with the prior version, and actually possibly even more so, really performs quite well. It's very bold lume, it's in keeping with the dive style. It endures well. It has, as you can see here, a nice strong presence to it. But one of the things that they did add is this one, in addition to having still across the markers as well as the handset and even the bezel, this one actually has the crown that has an accent for lume now as well. So that was a cool feature to see on this V2 version. Shifting over to the bezel, in keeping with its dive styling, this remains a 120 click unidirectional bezel. As far as the bezel edge, you can see that this is somewhat of like a scallop cut, but it is, again, keeping with that hexagonal theme here, so you can see it is somewhat angular for it. It is principally going to be polished, and that polishing does carry over to this ceramic bezel insert, which, as you can see, is a full polish as well. Always going to be a fingerprint magnet for that, but that's just kind of the nature of the beast. I personally like the look, though, of black polished bezel inserts. Once again, this features the shield-style pip at the 12 o'clock position. Then you have your hashes in the 5-minute increments. And at your 10 minutes, you have your numerals as well. The hashes here, as we already talked about, this has somewhat of like a salmon coloration, so it's a little bit red, a little bit orange, kind of salmon in there for that. So it doesn't perfectly match the dial accents, but I do think it looks good and works well overall. As far as the action, let's go and listen to that. You can hear a nice tactile click to it. It is what I would describe as a medium weight. It's definitely not a real light one, but it's not a real stiff one either. I think it's pretty well dialed in overall. Once again, the bezel, as we'll talk about, is a little bit on the slippery side, but I haven't found any issues with manipulation. As far as the case itself, the case here, once again, is going to carry through, where it has that angular style to it, but it has a nice round flow to the underside. So I think it keeps in with the overall theming, while at the same time having that comfort and that overall kind of graceful flow for that downturn. The finishing is going to be principally front to rear, so horizontal brushing, but then it does have nice aggressive polished angles, as you can see for those chamfer cuts, and those do follow that angular case, which again keeps with that very cohesive hexagon theme as you go throughout. As far as the downturn, you can see that this comes almost flush with the case back. It's enough so that I don't think it really gets that flying saucer effect or anything along those lines. As far as the crowns themselves, they again do carry through with that hexagonal, so you can see not only the cuts there, but then additionally they have that kind of taper into the bracelet, which I think with being a little bit on the larger side as far as the overall watch, I do think that helps to kind of visually slim that out some. On the 3 o'clock side, you can see it does have integrated crown guards that nicely nest around that crown. As far as the crown itself, this is measuring in at 6.7 millimeters. In keeping with the dive styling, it is a screw-in construction. You can see the milling here is a coin edge type finish there, which I think complements and works well overall. So even though it is different than the bezel, I think it works well with it, and it gives you a nice purchase for that. As far as the crown itself, as we already looked at, this is now signed with the lume accent. So it was previously signed with the milled in, now it has the lume accent filled in there as well. Shifting over to the caseback. The caseback is going to be very similar to the predecessor, and this one is again going to be a screw-in construction, principally brushed with its finishing. In the middle there, you can see that it does have an exhibition window, which they have a real neat pattern for a gilt that's inlaid onto that exhibition glass. So that nicely not only plays with the light, but it still gives you that exhibition effect in that you can see the rotor through that. It's a nice way to conceal an undecorated movement while still making it interesting and making use of the exhibition back. Shifting over to the bracelet on this, just as with the prior, is going to be tapered from 22 millimeters at the lug down to 20 millimeters at the clasp. As we already talked about, it does have male end links, which do protrude. However, they are really not too bad, especially with the significant drop where they drop almost straight down. So it really doesn't, despite the specs, doesn't really add to actually the length on the wrist as much as you would think. The finishing is once again going to be principally brushed, but it does have those polished chamfers on the outside. And again, it keeps with that kind of flat link hexagonal theme where that carries throughout the entirety of this watch. The articulation is actually surprisingly solid, especially for the links of this style. They look a little bit chunky visually, however they actually drape nicely over the wrist, so no real issues with comfort there at all. The clasp is another one of those areas that have been upgraded since the original. It's still going to be a double pusher kind of construction. You can see that this is principally going to be a brush finish, but it has like a blasted with a line down the middle as well as their logo. When you open up that double pusher, you can see a nice milled bridge there. One of the things though that they updated is, in addition to a relatively slim or slender profile overall, they went from 3 micro adjust holes to 5, which I think is a very welcome addition there. So I'm glad to see that. Alright, so now that we have all the basic specs out of the way, let's go ahead and bring in a few different comps so we can get an idea of what this is like. So first, here it is next to the Hexmariner 39. And this just gives you an idea of the sizing. As you can see, of course, the larger version that we're looking at today, the V2, this is going to be more visual presence for it. However, it's not overly large in comparison, so I think depending on your wrist size and your preferences, I think either of these would work well for most. But one of the things I want to look at is you can see this is what that 3D pyramid looks like, and this white dial version is available on this V2 in the full size as well. So that's a nice touch there. All right, shifting over next, here it is next to a Zelos hammerhead. This is the titanium version, so hammerhead 3 in the titanium. Gives you an idea here, this one's coming in around 44 millimeters, but it has a smaller dial. So just gives you an idea of the overall kind of visual presence of those two. And then shifting over for something different, this is the RZE Fortitude, so more of a pilot style fixed bezel, kind of Oris inspiration with that bezel there, but just gives you an idea as far as overall sizing. This one I believe is 41 millimeters, so it gives you an idea of the presence there. All right, so now that we have all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and wrap things up with my personal view of the positives, critiques, as well as the overall summary. And a lot of this borrows from the prior version because there's not a whole lot that has changed overall for this. One of the things that I mentioned in the past was the excellent value. While the prices have gone up a little bit on these, the pricing is still coming in very solidly. For those standard or those 3D textured versions, they start at $298. The Aventurine versions start at only $325, which is really crazy for an Aventurine watch. And then this special edition PVD-coated Meteorite version only comes in at $435, so really not too bad there at all. Each of those, I think, really gives you a strong value, even if it is bumped up from the original version. As far as the color range, they have so many different colors, not only with 11 options available, you can get a bunch of different colors, you can get full lume, you can get texture dial, you can get meteorite dial, Aventurine dial, they've got that limited version that's Mahjong. Across the board, they've got a little bit of something for everybody, so huge range of options there. Just as with the prior version, I think this is exceptionally well thought out. We've talked about as we went throughout here, those touches that they did, I think without being overly done, they really have those hexagon or that hexagonal theme throughout the entirety of the watch. And I think it's one of those things that I don't think it's tacky or gaudy the way that they incorporated it, but it's so well thought out. Everywhere they could incorporate hexes, they did so, and that's really nice. Comfort, surprisingly, this watch, with being not the lightest in the world nor the smallest in the world on my 6.5-inch wrist, is still extremely comfortable. So despite the chunkier look to the bracelet, it actually drapes well, it wears lighter than it otherwise appears, so I think that's solid. And then finally, this white meteorite. As I mentioned, I think this is the first time that I've ever personally seen a white meteorite dial. It's a really cool effect. I love a natural or raw meteorite. However, this white meteorite, what's really cool is it still picks up all those striations and everything, but it really just gives a playfulness. And especially because it is so subtle at some angles, you almost can't see it. You can always get kind of that like camo or shadowed effect to it. But when you get that light that just pops off of it, you get those striations that fully come through. I think it really works quite well, and it's a fun take on being able to have a more subdued white dial without being boring. But what about the critiques? Just as with the prior, so we're looking at a prototype here, but there is some finishing pieces. As you can see here on the end links, these arrived with scratches, and that's actually on both of them. I think that was from attaching the bracelet to it. I expect that that's just a prototype issue, but there are little things there that I do want to point out because I saw them here. So while it is a prototype, that's something I certainly hope that they'll clean up because that would not be acceptable on a production version. The bezel, as we already talked about, it is definitely on the slippery side. As you can see here, it's polished, but it's not at real deep or aggressive, and it's on the edge with that cut, so it really doesn't give you a whole lot of traction. I haven't had any issues, but it definitely is one of those things that I do think that could be improved, but it would be with some functional, or rather I should say some stylistic changes for the functional impact. And then just as I mentioned on the prior, they did stick with 3 lines of text. I still do wish they'd go down to 2. I think it would balance out the dial a little bit better at the 6 o'clock position. I think just Hexmariner and then the water resistance, lose the automatic in my opinion. I think that would be visually a little more pleasing, but it's really not too bad, and that's a minor nitpicky thing. So where does that leave us overall? Just as with the prior one, this one I have to say, for me personally, I'm not a huge fan of homages, or really the Submariner for that matter. It's a fine watch, and I appreciate its story throughout history of watch. But that being said, this watch for me, it is personally my favorite of the Hexmariner homages that I've seen, or at least Submariner inspired watches. So the Hexmariner, I think they were on the right idea of what an homage should be, which is taking inspiration from another watch while really making it your own. And I think they've done just that. So there you have it. This has been a look at the V2 version. As always, if you did like it, do tap that like button. If you haven't already done so, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment. Let me know what you think. Do you like any of these versions? Do you prefer this larger version or the 39mm size? What's your favorite dial? All that kind of good stuff. Thanks for watching.